Welcome to Old Path and our study through the New Testament book of Hebrews. We're going to be completing the third chapter today. And as I mentioned in the previous weeks, this is a difficult book to try to keep the flow of if you're having to just kind of stop when you've expired the time that you have allotted to you, because it's a continuing thought. So it is important that we kind of go back and look at what was the last study. But you're going to find that it really does continue on, even in the same wording, into the next chapter. So remember what we've done so far, and I hope this doesn't seem to belabor the point, but if we kind of catch what's being said here, we are once again faced with this study here. It is completely obvious just by the content of what we read that this is a man with a great understanding, whoever the writer is, of the Jewish culture and of their history. More importantly, their history of the Jewish people. So the reasoning here is purely Jewish, and it is appealing to a group of people not to repeat, in this case, the same mistakes made by their ancestors, and it becomes obvious what he's getting at here in this particular passage. So wonderfully done here. The writer will take a particular passage from the 95th Psalm, and that's what's quoted here starting in verse 7. And what his appeal to them is not to repeat the same mistake that was made the last time or at another time. I mean, there were plenty of times when the nation had fallen into unbelief. But the writer here singles out one particular place. So it's a good thing for us to be able to say, when we study through the text, it's good for us to know the historical reasons why something is being said. This is definitely unapologetic from the writer to a group of people, warning them not to do something that they're contemplating doing. And he wants to make sure that there is an understanding of what the consequence would be to this course of action that they're considering. So when we get to us as Christians, and not from a Jewish background, when we hear the arguments that are here, we can say, I know that passage, I know those places, I know the history of it, but we want to make sure that we fully grasp this. If we are Gentiles and part of the church, we can understand the reasons why he would say the things that he would say, but it is not our history. It is a Jewish history. So in the application part of it, we as Christians would want to say, we don't want to go outside of what the only possible way that man can be saved, and that is in the person of Jesus Christ. So to the Gentiles within the church, we want to say there's no way that we can be saved outside of belief and faith in the finished, completed work of Jesus at the cross for the forgiveness of sins. Any Gentile in the church would be able to say that as well. But we're not, as Gentiles, concerning ourselves with going back to trying to keep the law in order to secure for ourselves salvation. There's no reason for us. It's not where we come from. Not to mention the fact that it wouldn't be something that God would accept. So that's the big takeaway from this. Anybody who would want to go outside of what God has put in place to reconcile man to himself, they're going to be on their own, because there is no covering for them. There is nothing that deals with the matter of sin. In this case, the writer of Hebrews is speaking specifically to a Jewish audience who is considering going back to the law and to the keeping of the law, thinking that that would be something that God would see as righteousness and that it would secure for them, heaven or eternity. So we want to be careful that we look at this book in its correct context, understanding to whom it is being written, and we can make the proper application to us in the church. But let's be really, really careful to realize that the person that is writing this and the people to whom it is written are very much considering going back to the law in order to be right before God. And he's going to use that history that they have in common to explain to them what they're going back to, never offered them, in this case, rest. And he's going to use the occasion from Numbers chapter 14. We're going to look at these passages because they're very important. The quote that we get from this, starting at verses 7 to 11, are taken directly from the 95th Psalm. And we're going to go read that kind of in its entirety. But let's, before we do that, let's remember what we've just studied in the last week. So what we looked at in the earlier part of chapter 3, Moses is the first of the individuals to whom or about whom the writer is going to compare Jesus. So he says that as great as Moses was, and through whom came the law, what we have in the person of Jesus is the one that to us came grace and truth. And we looked at John chapter 1 about that. So Moses was faithful, it says, in what he did in his house, as it's referred to here, but yet he was still just a servant, as were the angels, as were any other people. They were simply servants that God had sent. In the person of Jesus, he is the builder of the house, and so he's no mere servant. He's one who came and did the work that God had sent him to do, but he's also the builder of the house, and so his house, his legacy is greater than Moses. So Moses did what he was sent here to do and accomplished those tasks, never even entering into the rest because of unbelief like everyone else that's mentioned here. Moses was the last of those to die off in the wilderness before they could be brought in under the leadership of Joshua, and we're going to study a little bit about him today. So what we want to make sure we see in front of us and our understanding of the text that is here before us is to say this is very much a writing from a Jewish man to other Jewish people with the intent of them seeing that if they go back to the law to try to keep it as a means of making themselves right before God, it has far too many deficiencies in it, and that straightforward way of looking at it, without the sacrifice of Jesus, there is simply no way for man to be reconciled to God, and that is the issue. So we pick up in chapter 3. We're going to start at verse 7. And again, from last week, Jesus is superior to Moses in that Moses was a person who ministered in his house yet as a servant. Jesus in his ministry was the builder of the house. So it was a greater enduring legacy because it's eternal in Jesus. And more importantly, it is a greater house and it is a greater legacy because of its message and the completeness of that. So with the law, and we're going to see this so much in this book, it was such a temporary thing with Moses, and all of the offerings and everything that was part of the law was never a completed thing. It had to be repeated over and over again. Whether it was the keeping of the feasts or the sacrifices, whatever it may be, it was all the time. It was always having to reconcile man through the offering of something innocent for the guilty. In the person of Jesus, it's a once and for all offering, and this is why there is rest that is mentioned. And that's going to be developed as it pertains to the church and to the believers in chapter 4. What we have here, coming out of the discussion of Moses and the greatness of Jesus relative to Moses, and the differences that there are between them, now he's going to come to that place of rest and that understanding that in the person of Jesus, the believer, Jew or Gentile alike, can enter into a rest because it is the promise that God had given. And so he's going to use the example of God was ready to bring the people into their rest, and that would be the going in and occupying the nation of Israel, the land that was promised to them. Instead, because of unbelief, they wandered for 40 years. They never rested. It was just a never-ending 40 years of being reminded over and over and over again about their rebellion and how they had never been able to rest. They were just going from one place to another, and they never saw the promise. That's what the writer here wants people to understand, and that laying before them, these readers of this book, God has offered rest. Will you take it or will you reject it? That's the issue. And going back to something that God will not recognize as a means to salvation means that you will never enter into the rest that God has given to you. So we pick it up at verse 7 today. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll look at the text. Father, we thank you for what we read here and for the importance of it, how we are able to take away from the passage the things of importance. Help us to grasp the reasoning behind what the writer of Hebrews says, and help us in the church of mainly Gentiles and not looking back at the history that is that of the Jewish people. Let us make the proper application to realize that there is nothing outside of Jesus that can reconcile man. Our good works, our attempts to be right because of our actions, all of those things will fail because you only recognize one way. Help us to see that in the text that is here. And we give you all thanks and pray that you would open our eyes to your word. We give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so what he does here in verses 7 to 11, we're going to read it here first, and then we're going to go to take a look at the 95th Psalm where it's taken verbatim. So it says, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, and this is the quote, starting the quote, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the day of rebellion, in the day of trial in the wilderness. Now, if we were to look at this, there are a number of places that could be shown as a place of rebellion in the wilderness. There were a number of different places that could be pointed to. But we're going to go look at the one I believe that it's clearly talking about. Where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation, and I said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath that they will not enter my rest. So again, the question of rest, that was what was offered to them. And let's remember that what we're about to read, first of all, we'll look at the Psalm first, but then we're going to go to Numbers 14. The 40 years of their wandering around in the wilderness really kind of started after something that was very short into their exodus. And that was to go and spy out the land, take a look at what God had offered to them. But because of unbelief, they feared and would not go to the place that God had given to them. So in the big picture, what we have here, whether we want to try to make application to the church or if we're looking at here Israel, what we have is a very straightforward thing. God made a promise to the children of Israel. I've taken you out of your captivity and your bondage to Egypt, and now I'm going to bring you into the land that I had promised to your fathers. From Abraham onward, you're going to go and you're going to take the land now. That's the promise. So that should mean that any contingency, well, what about this and what about that? What about this and these different things when we get to that particular place? What are we going to do about this or anything else? The promise is, this is the land that I've given to you. So that means that any potential problem that happens when they get into the land is something that God already knows about and can make provision for. And so there's no reason for them to worry. And that's what you're going to see in two of the spies. So I don't want to get too far ahead of us, but we've got to be able to say when God makes a promise, any reason that we might have for questioning the promise, it has to be reminded, we have to remind ourselves, it has to be remembered that God knows all these things in advance. So anything that could cause us to have concern about the particular promise, God already knows anything that could be a potential problem and has seen to it. So the promise to the believer is simply this. If we trust in Jesus and his sacrifice for our sins and the shedding of his own blood for that forgiveness, then promised to us is an entrance into heaven where we will abide with him, and that will be our forever state. We will be in direct fellowship with God, the one who loves us. Book of Revelation, starting in chapter 21, and it's a forever thing. It'll start with the millennial kingdom, which is chapter 19 and into 20, but the forever kingdom, this is where we will always be in direct proximity to God. So that's our promise. So whatever happens here and now, that promise is secure. That's our rest. That's where we're headed to. So everything here is just for this temporal time. And every promise is future to us, and so we're to rest in that. Thinking somehow that, well, we're going to go back and do X, Y, or Z, and thereby getting our entrance into heaven, God would say, no, there's one way and one way only. Jesus' own word said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. That is, to me, a very freeing thing, because I can look at him and say, great, that's his responsibility and not mine. Does that mean that I live any way that I want to and whatever's pleasing to me? The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible tells us that we're new creations in Christ Jesus. And so if that's the case, we're supposed to act accordingly. And so much of Paul's writing is, how do we conduct ourselves here and now, knowing what we know as we await that forever promise that's been given to us, that rest? So that's kind of the backdrop as we would understand it for the church. For the Jewish people reading this, they're going to be reminded of something in their history where they didn't believe, and therefore there was a horrible consequence to them. So, again, as we read this, I want to read one more time, verses 7 to 11. And actually, we can go to Psalm 95, because I want to read the verses that are before it. Let's go to Psalm 95. And we'll see it's a very interesting thing, because the psalm that has been quoted here, the first part of it is something totally different. It's not like it isn't, of course it's related, and you can see that as you read it, but it almost seems like there is a change of topic within the psalm, because it starts out being very much worshipful, and it is very much a matter of praise and thanksgiving. So the Psalm 95, verse 1, "O come and let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms. For the Lord is the great God, and the great King above all gods. In his hands are deep places of the earth. The height and the hills are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. O come and let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our God, our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and we are the sheep of his hands." Those of you, especially if you grew up around Calvary Chapels, know that song. That was one of the worship songs that we did, verses 6 and 7. It's one that we sang repeatedly growing up around church, and I don't hear it very often anymore, but this was the beauty of the worship back in the day when we first got saved. There were so many verses that were just taken verbatim and converted into song or made into songs, and it was a wonderful thing. We could sing worship, but we were learning scripture at the same time. So this is one of those passages that when I read it, there was a person that was very important in my life in those days, because he was the worship leader where we were there at Cypress, and his name was Charles Buford. We knew him as Pedro, and he goes back to the band Mustard Seed Faith, and he was the one who led worship for years and years and years at Cypress. So when I read this passage, I hear it in his voice. So verses 6, "Oh, let's come and worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." And when I said earlier, I said our God, our Maker. That's the way that the song goes. "For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hands." So notice immediately in that context, in the middle of the verse, it changes to what we just read. "Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me, and they tried me, though they saw my work. For 40 years I was grieved with that generation, and said, if it is a people who go astray in their hearts, and they do not know my way. So I swore in my wrath, that they shall not enter my rest." So we look for the event that really caused this whole reason. What was the rebellion, and what was it that kept them from going into their rest, the rest that God had promised them? So we can look at a number of different places during their time of their sojourn in the wilderness, and we could say, is it this event or is it that event? What we want to remember is that most of the rebellion that we might think of really kind of came after the initial offense that they had before God. And so their resistance to him happened repeatedly over and over and over again, but that was during their 40 years. What's really a heavyweight thing, and we're going to look at the passage in this, why the 40 years? And ultimately it's this: it took 40 years for all of those that God had judged as being in unbelief for them to die off. I don't know how else to say it. It sounds pretty harsh, but that's really the reason for why did it take so long. So let's remember, they come out of the Exodus, they leave from Egypt, they are brought right to the precipice of walking into into Israel and taking the land that God had promised them. They were ready to go in. And because of what the spies had to say, they fell into a place of unbelief, and God said, "You're looking at the circumstances, you don't trust me, and you're not going to enter into the rest because I've promised it to you, but you don't trust me." And so they were going to have to wander around in the wilderness for those 40 years until they had all died off, and then they were able to go in under Joshua and subdue and to take the land as God had said. And even at that, they didn't do it perfectly. So, once again, David writes this, and so let's remember he's 500 years after the time of the Exodus, and so this is quite a ways into their history further, but David begins this psalm by just proclaiming all of these worshipful things that he says, but then reminding the people of what caused the rebellion in the first place, and for what they were judged, that they would never enter into the rest. So here the warning is very, very clear. Don't have a repeat of what happened the last time that God says, I offer you rest. And go in and take what has been given to you. In the church sense, it's that Jesus has given his life that we can be reconciled to God and have peace with him and enter into the rest, a break from our own labor of trying to do things on our own. We can look to him, the one who offers rest. In this case, it would be a rest from their sojourn and walking from one place to another. Go and take the land that God has given to you, that he said you would prosper in it. Just go and take it. And yet they gave every reason why they couldn't go in and lay hold of it. So let's take a look at that particular passage. And so that's found in the book of Numbers, chapter 14. And you probably know what it is. It's the guys who went in to spy out the land before they went in at Kadesh Barnea. And again, this happens at the front part of their time coming into the land. So unfortunately, there is the problem that even Moses gets caught up in all of this, because again, Moses didn't get a chance to go in. So all of these major players that we might think of who had had a major part, aside from Joshua, of the main figures that we have, none of the other ones are going to make it in. So whether it's Miriam, whether it's Aaron, whether it is Moses, these are all people who God used prominently, and yet they're going to be left in the wilderness. They would not step foot in the land that God had given to them. Now, technically, by the time that you get to Kadesh Barnea would be inside of what we would consider Israel proper. So they did get into where the land was, but they never went into the place that, as moving north, they would get into what is really the inhabited part. That's what we get when we get to chapter 14 of the book of Numbers. So hopefully you're there. If not, go ahead and turn to Numbers 14. So it says, we can actually look at verse 20. Let's read the whole thing. Let's get to verse 26 of the previous chapter, chapter 13. Now they departed, and they came back to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness at Paran, at Kadesh. They brought back word from them and all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. So we're jumping right into the context of this. Obviously, it's a lot of text, but they've already chosen the 12 people that would go into the land and bring back a report to the people. What should we expect when we get there? So this is jumping right into that context. They're bringing back the report. They brought fruit, which just let them know how plentiful things would be in that place. Let's remember something else, because it's very important. That when God had said, when you go in to these places, you're going to see that you'll go in and take a land that's already producing everything for you. You'll see cities, and you'll see groves, and you'll see everything that's already planted and dug and built, and you're just going to go in and take it. It's given to you. Remember, I think I had pointed out last week that when God sent his people into the land, he was sending them in to be, first of all, it was going to make good on a promise, but God was also using them as his hand of judgment. God had already made a judgment on the people of the land, and now justice was coming, and it would be delivered in the hands or by the hands of his people as he brings them back into the land. But even that is going to be deferred for 40 years because of this event. This happens at the front end of their sojourn. So, verse 27, when they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. This is just, here's the example. Look at how this is. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land, are strong. The cities are fortified with and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And so these would be, you see that there's the concern about giants. And again, these are very mysterious. The earliest that you hear of them start at Genesis chapter 6. They're abnormally large people. And the big debate is, well, are they superhuman? Are they the spawn of demons? What's the case? They are unnaturally large, not just big people. There's something very unnatural about them. And they have raised the ire of God clearly in this, in that they're singled out for being very different than normal. So again, that's a big debate. Why is God so focused on them as having such a problem with them? And then there's the other side that would say, well, they have to be just freakishly large people because angels cannot procreate. Well, you have real problems on either side of this whole thing, because why does God single them out for such, for such judgment and for such concern? And so that's a whole debate. I'm trying not to go too far into it because it's a real side trip kind of a thing. But it begins with the Nephilim before there was a flood, and now after the flood, there are still the same concerns. They're still there now. So they're not among us today, though people try to debate that. We don't have these freakishly large Goliath kind of people with the 6 fingers and all the rest. There was something very, very weird about those people. So anyhow, without, again, getting too far into it, nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified, verse 28, and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak, or the Anakim, and this is the concern. These are those freakishly large people, and they're still in the land. There's a concern. Now, the Amalekites dwell in the land to the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the banks along the banks of the Jordan. So the whole of the properties that they want to go in and take a look at, the land promised to Abraham, is filled with people that will be a real problem to them even once they get into the land and go on for generations. So they bring back this report. There's giants in the land, massive cities, and all of these adversaries live pretty much throughout the entirety of the place that we're supposed to go. So remember, God promised them rest. I want to take you to this land and I'm going to give you rest. They go in and search out the land, and now they start to see circumstances. But wait a minute. The land of our rest is filled with giants and fortified cities that are massive, and all of these adversaries dwell in the entirety of the land. Here's your problem. Got one or two replies to this whole thing. Maybe God doesn't know that they're all there, and maybe he's made promises but doesn't understand all of the situation. Well, that's absurd on its face, because how is it that God would say these kind of things and not have contingency in place? And are these not the same people who just watched everything happen at the Exodus? God defeated the entirety of the Egyptian army, and they didn't have to lift a finger to do it. So was it too big of a deal for God to have taken out the Egyptians but not take out the people in this land? Just simple rationale, just simple reasoning, common sense, and trust would say, well, he did it with the Egyptians, he's going to have to do it here. But you're going to notice that that's not really how it goes down, but for a few. So Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are able to overcome it. Now again, they're not able to overcome it under normal circumstances. What he believes is that, well, wait a minute, God gave us this to go do it. Look at what he says. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go in or go up against these people, for they are stronger than we. Now, under normal circumstances, great, make that case. But here Caleb, and as we'll see Joshua as well, said, but wait a minute, did God not promise it to us? Or are we looking at this simply through human means? They're greater in size, greater in number, and they've got the high ground, they've got the fortified cities. How can we possibly do this? Okay, that's spoken as just men looking at the circumstance without God in the picture. So, verse 32. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report on the land which had been spied out, saying, the land throughout which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. There we also saw giants, the descendants of Anak, and they came from giants. And we are like grasshoppers in their sight, and so we were in our own sight and in theirs, basically is what's being said. So all the congregation lifted up their voices, and they cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should become victims? Would it not have been better for us to return to Egypt? This is the cry of cowardice. These are men who are looking at circumstances, but completely removing out of the equation a couple of very important things. is God able to make good on his promises? And secondly, have we even considered him in the equation? So again, they want to blame God for the problem, but they don't want to trust him that he's able to make good on the promise. So again, they were given a straightforward question, a straightforward option. I want to take you into a land. That's the place of your rest. Circumstances should not have any way of deciding anything for you because God knows all of those things beforehand. He's been miraculous over and over and over again, and very recently in the way that he had delivered them out of Egypt. So the idea that they have forgotten that so quickly, and now they're just looking at everything else. Now they want to blame God, and they're using their wives and children as their reason for unbelief. It's okay about us, but we're worried about our wife and kids. Well, God hears that. So look at what he says. So they said to one another, let us select a leader and we will return to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all of the assembly and the congregation of the children of Israel. So here's the thing. This is really where everything starts to go bad. At this point, Moses and Aaron could have said, well, what you guys want to do, that's on you. But that's just set out of unbelief. So they kind of fell into the same thing, Moses and Aaron, rather than siding with Joshua and Caleb and saying the same thing that they did. Wait a minute, you're looking at circumstances. Didn't God promise this to us? The same God that delivered us out of Egypt is delivering us into this place, and he'll take care of those problems. Why are we so concerned? But don't let the door, hit you. We'll let you go. It's fine. Do the things that you want to do, but don't expect us to get involved with it. Instead, here, Moses and Aaron and the other people fall into that same, what are we going to do? That's unbelief. So we see in verse 6, but Joshua, the son of Nun, Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all of the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land that we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. The Lord delights in us. Then he will bring us into the land, and he will give it to us, and the land, that it is a land that flows with milk and honey. Period. It's already promised. This is what we heard in Exodus. God said, I'm taking you to that place. You see how simple this is? These are guys who are saying, well, we can let circumstances dictate how we're going to conduct ourselves, or we can just fall back on this. God knew what we were going to encounter. He's the one who sent us there in the first place. So whatever we encounter there, if we encounter it, he's going to clearly take care of the problem. Let's go. It's his problem. It's not ours. So to the church, or even to the Jewish people at this time, the promises that are made by God are not up to us to say, well, how's it going to work? I don't have to know those things. All I know is that God says, when your life is over, whether it's me going in the rapture, which I believe exists, if I go in the rapture, or if I die of some age and I go to see the Lord, I'm not concerned about my future, because it's already secure in the person of Jesus Christ, in whom I have trusted for my salvation. Why do I worry? Why should I? I shouldn't. That's kind of the same thing here. They're walking by faith because God promised it. And they're standing on that, and they're saying, forget about the circumstances. Why are we worried about that? That's not our concern. So, only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us, so do not fear them. And all the congregation said to stone them, and stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before the children of Israel. Oh boy. So they're getting ready to kill the only two guys who gave the right report, and God shows up. So you know where this is going, right? So again, what a great place for the writer of Hebrews to take this discussion, if you will, or this reason for them not rebelling, is to go back to something that not only did they have a way that they could look at as a choice, it was the beginning of the nation that would enter into the land. And so again, as the writer writes to these people, they know the land that was given to them. They're familiar with the stories. Now they're also having to be reminded of a story where the people who had fallen into that rebellion and unbelief, God showed up right when they were having the debate and when they were going to kill the people who were actually doing as God said. It's better to get rid of the messenger, kill the messenger, and not have to deal with the message. Well, that may very well have happened here, except the glory of God shows up visibly, goes to the tent of meeting, and now Moses has to give account for this. So Verse 11, then the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me, with all of the signs which I have performed among them? How is it that they can look beyond everything that I've done so far and worry about the people in the land? How is that possible? So again, I have to be reminded how often we, even in our times, 2,000 years after Jesus, will still get stuck in those places of unbelief and not trust God, even though we should know that he knows everything and there's nothing that I can encounter that he's not prepared for. It's a human thing, obviously. So he says, I will strike them with pestilence, and I will disinherit them. And I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. And Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it, for your might, and for you have brought the people out from among them. So Moses, I think, does a really wonderful thing. If you bring us out here, even though we've rebelled, the ones who have rebelled, and you chastise us for the things that you've done, it will look so bad for not only us, but more importantly for you. It's going to bring a bad report against your name because, yeah, God could bring them out, but he couldn't deliver them to the rest of the way. So anyhow, let's just go ahead and jump down to verse 20 before time gets away from us. So the Lord says, now I have pardoned according to your word. So Moses intercedes there. You can go back and read it. But truly, verse 21, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I have done in Egypt and in the wilderness, and all have put me to the test now these 10 times. So there's already been things that have been going on. This is early on, right? And they have not heeded my voice. Now certainly, they certainly shall not see the land which I have sworn to their fathers, nor shall any of them who have rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he is different from him, he has a different spirit in him, he has followed with me, and he has followed me fully, and I will bring into the land where he went. I will bring him into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit. And we know that Joshua is mentioned in with this as well. So you can go and read. There's so much more that's here, but again, we've got to get back to the book of Hebrews. But this is, I think, pretty clearly the event that's being spoken of as the writer of Hebrews is explaining this, not entering into his rest and that unbelief that happened. And look at the devastating consequences of it. All of them who were promised the land never got a chance to see it, except for the children. The ones that they were used as the excuse, our children. And so remember what God says, I'm going to only allow those who are 20 and younger, except for Joshua and Caleb. The rest of you are going to die out here in the wilderness, and yeah, it's going to take 40 years for it to happen. So what should have been just days to get into was going to be 40 years, and none of them were going to get to see it except for the kids. So pretty amazing. So we see back in the book of Hebrews, let's turn back there. And so he's made the case. Don't fall into unbelief. You have a history that you can look back on, the writer of Hebrews would say. You have a history to look back on in that when God makes a promise, take the promise. When he offers you rest, take the rest. Because if you come up with reasons not to, you're going to have to deal with the consequences. So back in chapter 3 of the book of Hebrews, we get to verse 21. So he calls them and he says to them, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. Now that unbelief is apistis. Now when we hear you're faithful or you have faith, that's pistis. That means that we are faithful and that we have faith in the promises that God has given to us. Here he says, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief, apistis. So a lack of faith, a lack of trust, a lack of belief. In what? Or in whom? In Jesus. So if you have a lack of trust and faith in Jesus, then you're going to go back to something that God will no longer recognize because you won't take him at his word and you won't take him at his promise. He goes on to say one other thing, that after this unbelief, it will then lead to a departing away from the living God. So this word here for departing is where we get the word apostasy. And so in Acts chapter 5, it talks about being drawn away. And that's the place in Acts chapter 5 is after they had threatened to do this all of what they had threatened to do against the disciples, it's one man who stands up and says, well, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't be so hasty in trying to stomp this whole thing out, because let's remember there was people who had risen up before, and they had drawn people away from themselves. Actually, they said they drew them away. But if that's what this Jesus is and these guys, they'll be just like those other ones. It'll make a bunch of noise for a while, but they'll just go away, and they came to nothing. However, if this is a work of God, you can't stand against it. So really, really amazing thing that is said here. So what we have is that place of unbelief, apistis, that will lead to apostasy. That means leaving from, being drawn away, in this case, drawn away by somebody else that's probably saying you need to keep the law if you want to be right before God. Forget about what you've heard. There's more that you need to do, and the law will save you. So that would be, at that point, going back to the law is seen here by the writer as being a departing from the Lord. Now here's a question. Can you depart from the Lord if you're not with him? Because this is a big debate in the book. Is this being written to unbelievers or to believers? Well, how do you move away, or how do you apostatize away from God unless you were there with him in the first place? And it would be based upon you fall into a place of unbelief, having been in a place of belief before. So people will say, well, they were never really fully saved. All right, well, that distinction is not made in the text. And what they're being told is that you have this way that you can be right before God, you're faithful, and you're not in a place of unbelief, and you're certainly not in a place of apostasy. However, if you take your choice and you do the thing that you're talking about doing, you will find yourself to then be unfaithful, and you will find your place of being in a place of apostasy, being drawn away from the Lord in whom you now are. So a person isn't born into faith. A person has to make a proclamation and a trust and a belief. They have to come into that place of belief in God. So this, again, raises the debate, the big question. Is it possible for a person to have a belief and then reject that same belief? Now, again, that's not usually the way that the whole discussion is framed. You've heard me say it a million times. Usually, well, can you lose your salvation? Read this text here. They wouldn't be losing anything because they're doing this eyes wide open, especially because the writer here is saying, you need to consider seriously what you're thinking about doing. Because what you're thinking of doing, there is no life in that. What you will find yourself to be, you may be faithful going back to the law, but according to the Lord, you will then be unfaithful and you will be an apostate. And there is no hope for you at that point. You will never enter the rest that he has promised to you. Just as our ancestors did not get to the rest that God had promised to them because of their unbelief and being concerned about circumstances, they rebelled against God and they had their consequence. But it wasn't as though they didn't know who God was. They're Jewish people, but they fell into a place of unbelief. Well, he says the same thing is possible here. So again, if it's not even a potential, then there's no reason for giving a warning in it. And so the text does not give me the impression anywhere in it that these are unbelievers who have just heard about Jesus and have dabbled around the edges. But again, how is it that you can apostatize away from God unless you are there present with him? So again, people can debate that. I've heard all the different arguments back and forth, and but we're sealed by the Holy Spirit. Yes, we are. That's why I don't worry about any time. Because of my belief in Jesus, I'm untouchable in the spiritual sense. But can I of my own free will abandon that and say I don't want what I've professed to have believed before? I reject that now. If we believe in free will, then that has to be a potential, and that makes all of these warnings possible. The language in it just doesn't seem to leave me any other options. So, if you have any questions about that, you're welcome to contact me through the website. Again, I'm just taking what the text says here, and I don't see options to this. Verse 13. Now, it says, but exhort one another. So don't fall into unbelief. Don't get in the place of being unfaithful. Don't be in the place of apostasy. Don't go back to something. Here's what you should do instead. Rather exhort one another daily, while it is still called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. And that sin, it's not just all kinds of general sin. Remember, the only thing that's being discussed here is unbelief. So what's a great way for people to not fall into unbelief? Have others that are around you. Hey, let me encourage you. I understand somebody might make a compelling argument for why we should keep elements of the law. But in the person of Jesus, everything that the law ever demanded of us is completed in him. And the one thing that the law could never do in settling the issue of sin has been done in him. So let's not go back to that. So encourage one another with that kind of understanding, that kind of wording. Go back and accept and see that that's what's option. That's the option that's given to you. So let's exhort one another while it is still called today. And so that while we still have the opportunity, here the day is now. Let's do this. And let's not be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin, that being of unbelief. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast until the end. So again, that idea, people go, oh, now you're making this about works. This is all about belief. What are you talking about? They're trying to change the discussion that's here. So there is a contingency on this. There is a qualifier, if. So how do you enter into this rest? How do you get what God has promised? We have become partakers. It is an event that has taken place and it continues to this day. So it's based upon belief, not actions. Because remember, actions or works or the things that we produce, they happen after salvation because we become more like he is as time goes by. So yeah, there's going to be a change in our life in the way of our conduct. But our belief is a wholly different matter. You're not qualified or disqualified by the amount of things that you do right or wrong. You are qualified for heaven by your belief. And if you believe in Jesus, if you believe in what he has done and you read his word, you're going to see we live by a different standard. Not because of our own effort, but because he changes us from the inside and he changes our priorities. Or at least that's how it's supposed to be. So when he's able to say this, we have become partakers. Does that sound like something that you would say to an unbeliever? We're unbelievers, people who have been, it's already taken place and it has lasting result. We have then been partakers of Christ. And if means that it's a belief that continues on. And it doesn't mean that we fall in and out of favor. It just simply means, do you or do you not believe? Are there people that we could say they believed at one time and now they reject that? I know plenty of them. For people to say, well, they were never saved in the first place. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. But then that at that same time, because I know these people personally and I know what their testimony is, they would have taught this same passage just like I'm teaching it now. So if they could fall into a place of rebellion and rejection of God, having once professed belief, for people to say, well, they were just deceived and they were never saved in the first place, then I might be just as well, if that's the case. And I reject that. That everybody is, as my pastor said once, everybody's a potential spiritual miscarriage. That doesn't make any sense. There's no security in that. So, for we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast until the end. What you believe the day that you got saved, if that's what you believe when you go to see him face to face, that's what qualifies or disqualifies for heaven. Does that mean that there is a possibility that a person could unbelieve after believing? Well, again, why the caution if it's not even possible? So, verse 15. While it is said, and he repeats this from Psalm 95, it's what you see in verse 7, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. The rebellion was what we had looked at a little bit earlier. That's what took place in the wilderness. So, what's the end result of that? For who, having heard, rebelled? So he's going to ask a question. So the people who heard, who were they that rebelled? These are all rhetorical questions, and he answers them. Indeed, was it not all the people who came out of Egypt led by Moses? So the writer here is saying, if there's any question of what I'm talking about for sure here, let me make sure that you understand. You Jewish believers, the ones who are considering doing something that would be rejecting of God's promises, that's what we're talking about here, the writer would be able to say. In case you're wondering what I'm talking about, who are these people that I'm referring to? So he's able to say, who were they? Having heard, they rebelled. For who were they? Indeed, was it not those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now, with whom was he angry for those 40 years? These are all obvious rhetorical questions. And it says, he answers his own question, was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And of course the answer is yeah, exactly. Who was it? Well, we know who it was. And we know what the reason for it. We know the beginning of it. And then we see all of the folly for those next 40 years. Failure after failure, even some successes, but It's a life of futility for 40 years, all because they didn't believe in the first place. And they would do it more than once. Has God brought us back out here just to kill us in the wilderness? Insanity. Well, verse 18. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter into his rest, but to those who did not obey? Go and take the land. It's given to you. Whatever is there that you might see as a threat or a problem, just know that it's already something that God has taken care of and is aware of it. Trust him. Just like you trusted him in the Exodus and he came through there, he would do so everywhere else. So the writer of Hebrews is saying, look, you guys are just like our ancestors in the wilderness. God said, go take the land. Yeah, but there's all kinds of things that are frightening to us, and we won't be able to do it. Sure, under your own strength. Now, interestingly enough, that was very much a very human reaction because, yeah, you put us next to a whole bunch of people that are bigger than us with more weapons, if you will, or more ability and stronger and greater in number. Yeah, you can look at that and say it's probably a bad idea to go to war against people when we're outmatched. Yeah, but then figure into the equation that it's not you fighting the battle, but God himself. That was what Joshua and Caleb said. So what they could possibly be, the readers of this, what could they possibly be deliberating about? Why can we not trust that God will make good on the promise that he has given? And again, this is a problem that people have even today in the church. Well, wait a minute. How can God just give me everything like that and I don't have to do anything for it? Don't I have to earn something? I mean, how can God just forgive me and I'm not supposed to do something? Well, our duty and what we're supposed to do is walk with him by faith. And we walk with him in that way of sanctification. He is glorified in his people and he changes us as we go. That's what we're supposed to do. But the idea of eternity, that we would somehow earn it, takes everything that Jesus did and makes it about that's only good if we do something as well. The book of Galatians is a great examination of that particular topic. And the summation to it is what Paul says about that. Look, if we could be made righteous by keeping the law, then Jesus died with no cause. He died in vain. So very, very heavyweight thing. So again, to close out this part, he's going to start talking about there is a rest that is for the believer. He's trying to say that there was a rest offered to the Jewish believers and they abandoned it by unbelief. He's saying to these people here, don't repeat the problem that they fell into. Whatever circumstances, whatever their reasoning, whatever as they work through it, thought that it was impossible for God to make good on his promises, don't do what they did. It's only going to lead to your failure and to your downfall. So he's able to say this in verse 19. So we see, here's what we know. This is what we see, that they could not enter. And why is that? Why could they not enter into the land? Without making it some drawn out thing, unbelief. That was it. There was only one reason why they couldn't go in. Unbelief is the issue. Well, what about all these things and all the things that happened thereafter? It began with their matter of unbelief, and that continued in their 40 years of their wandering. So don't put yourself in the place where they were. So to the church, once again, we're not thinking the church may not struggle with, well, I have to go back and keep elements of the law. Though some people, for some extraordinary reason, think that we're supposed to keep elements of the law. We call it the Hebrew roots movement, and there are all kinds of variations of it. But then there are also other people who think, well, I want to be a believer, but I can't believe that we're not supposed to perform these works or that works. Whether that's just something that you think in your own mind, or if you're a part of a church that says you must do this, you must do that, and you must do that, or you cannot be saved. That's unbelief. Because again, everything that was done to secure our salvation was done before we were born. So the idea that we could somehow validate or make legitimate the work that's already completed in Jesus by our own actions, talk about pride and talk about hubris. It's disgusting. So it means that what Jesus did was not complete and that it's going to require something from us to validate and to complete that work. It's just nonsense. So what am I supposed to do as a believer? Trust and believe that Jesus died for my sin and that he will make good on those promises. In the meantime, I'm to walk with him. I'm to have my life be an example of who he is, and I'm to make sure that I make his word known to the masses, and that I would make him known to the masses as well. I can't do anything to earn my salvation. It is secure and it is finished in him. My faith and my trust is in him. And without that faith and trust in him, there is no salvation. It's a pretty straightforward thing. Now, chapter 4, we'll pick that up a little bit further. Again, I realize that some of the things that I've said are controversial because of what other people teach on this topic. And again, the idea that somehow we could fall out of belief really troubles some people. But again, it's not about sin, it's about unbelief. Now, unbelief, yes, is a sin, but the idea that people like to frame the discussion about, well, if you lose your salvation, and then they point out, well, that person did this thing and that thing and all the rest of it. Okay, people do those things because they're in a place of unbelief. Believers don't go out of their way to do this, that, or the other thing and practice sin and reject God and don't care what his opinion is on those things. They reject him entirely, like the children of Israel did. Yeah, we know what he did in Egypt. We know what he's promised, but we don't believe that he's good to make good on his promises. We're going our own way. And we're going to blame him in the process. So, and we want to be really, really careful that we don't fall into that same thing of somehow thinking that we can earn what God gives to us as a free gift. And what qualifies a person for heaven is whether or not they believe in his promise and what he's offered. And it's nothing to do with us. So we'll pick this up next week. And if you have any questions, again, about what I've shared and want to ask any questions, you can do so through the website at oldpaththeology.net. And you can get to the Contact Us page, and that's where you'll find a drop-down menu, and it sends us an email, and I'll be happy to answer those emails. So until next week, we'll pick up at chapter 4. Please read ahead. It's a fascinating read.